U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is this week visiting Ghana, Tanzania and Zambia, which will host the second summit for democracy. But there's been concern from one analyst that African countries don't have a unified strategy for managing their relationships with major powers. Why is this the case? Well, SishuwA joins me now for more on this. He's a senior lecturer in history at the Stellenbosch University. SishuwA, thank you so much for your time here on eNCA. Let's start firstly with a country like South Africa, where government is unable to comment after that ICC, report that they are going to ask countries to arrest Vladimir Putin, who obviously runs a country that is also quite powerful. Could it be because African countries feel they don't have a choice? They are dealing with powerful countries, number one, and most of the time when we want business or when we want people to invest in our country, it's mostly these countries, your US, your UK, and that's why we're unable to really deal with them in a unified way.
Thank you. I think that in the case of South Africa and Putin, in relation to the ICC indictment of the Russian president, I think the South Africa's attitude has to be explained by the historical ties that Pretoria has with Moscow. The Soviet Union supported the liberation struggle in many Southern African countries, including South Africa itself. And so there are those long-standing historical ties which has meant that moves like the one that the ICC has taken are received with a lot of skepticism for that reason, but also for the fact that the ICC is seen sometimes as, ignoring the violations of the Western leaders, for example, George Bush and Tony Blair, in relation to the invasion of Iraq. So Moscow is fortunate in that regard because, Russia is not the Soviet Union, and yet our leaders in the region still relate to Russia as if it is equivalent to the Soviet Union. So that's one thing at a much more national level. At the continental level, I would say that the country has struggled, to deal with major powers precisely because they lack a unified strategy for dealing with, say, China, the United States, the European Union, or indeed Russia itself. Despite the existence of the African Union, the continent has struggled to exert a kind of continental agency which would have enabled them to negotiate with a sense of collectivity to make sure that these powers don't pit one African country against the other, especially on those common issues where a much more collective position would be beneficial. But the other explanation is that, we have never had a Pan-Africanist leadership on the continent for a long time. You had this, I think, in the early 2000s when you had Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, you had Amela Senau in Ethiopia, or Obasanjo in Nigeria. And even before that, if you remember, during the period of the Cold War, you had this East-West divide. What enabled African countries to ride above that kind of divide were institutions like the non-aligned movement, which were formed by third world countries at a counter to that divide. But you also had leaders like, people like Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, who were able to imagine an Africa policy that made sure that the continent had unified position. Now, when you look across the continent, you cannot identify a single leader who is Pan-Africanist. And I think that the final reason I would cite as responsible for the absence of a unified strategy is that many of these countries, trade with China, with the United States, with the EU, more than they trade with each other, the African countries. So they would rather go to these countries and pursue bilateral ties rather than actually forging a common strategy that could bring massive benefits to the continent.
And what about continental agency? I mean, we are part of the 55 members of the African Union, but, for some reason, there's no unity in Africa, and it looks like we don't have the agency to tell our own stories.
I think that AU member states, 55 of them, as you said, prefer to advance individual, foreign objectives. And they prioritize bilateral ties with China, with Russia, with the United States, with the European Union, rather than presenting some kind of a collective position against any of these powers. Because this is what they do. The EU, for example, comes to Africa and negotiate with these individual countries as a collective themselves, not as each individual countries, but African leaders have failed to formulate the kind of continental agency that would make sure that when the issues like these arise, like the visit of Harris Kamala, for example, the leaders of Tanzania, the leaders of Zambia, the leaders of Ghana, they will contact their counterparts in the region or even across the continent to say, hey, what are the issues that we should present at the collective so that we benefit at the continent or at the region? Even in platforms like the SINO, China-Africa Summit, the EU Africa Summit, the United States Africa Summit, they don't often feature continental positions. And that has allowed these powers to exploit African countries by making sure that they pit them one against the other.
And it's so unfortunate because these are the countries that unfortunately have the strongest currency, have more money, and that's why I guess we always lean towards trying to please them. I mean, be part of BRICS, for instance, in South Africa, where you're China and Russia, for some reason, we have to try and maintain bilateral relations with them. So I guess then, Sishuwa, that that history of divide and conquer is still working against Africa.
It is, and that's largely because we have not really created some kind of a resource or knowledge base on the continent. If you look at South Africa, if you look at Zambia, you look at Tanzania, you look at any African country and say, what is the knowledge base that informs the policy, whether it's foreign policy attitudes towards any of these major powers, or that informs the policies in the mining sector, in the extractive sectors, for example? We don't really utilize our educated resources. So many of the time you find that we still go back to Western countries to get expertise from there, get consultants to come and advise us on issues where we require African scholars, African agency to define how we should relate to these powers. Even Russia and China, we often look at them as if they are one entity. They are different. We have to identify what are their interests, what are their motivations, how can we relate to them as Africa, as individual countries, but also as a continental board or even at the region, at SADC level, to make sure that we extract maximum benefits from these powers. I would imagine that unless we create a knowledge base and invest in the production of empirical knowledge that should inform policy, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's policy in relation to the extractive sector, we will continue getting a raw deal in relation to how we relate with these major powers.
Well, Sishuwa, thank you so much for your time here on eNCA. That is SishuwA. He's a senior lecturer in history at Stellenbosch University. Still a long way to go, Africa.